It's hard to believe we're living in a timeline where Mitch McConnell could be considered too liberal for anyone. But to JD Vance and the unhinged tech billionaires supporting him, McConnell and other old-school Republicans are so invested in the status quo that they might as well be Democrats.
We're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. And it's just a basic fact. You look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children.
Very famously, in 2009, he wrote an essay in which he said, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." He thinks democracy is outmoded and inappropriate, particularly since women got the right to vote.
I am proud to be gay. I am proud to be a Republican. But most of all, I am proud to be an American.
Much has been said about the terrifying technocrats backing JD Vance and what they may or may not have planned for the future of the Republican Party. Like many wealthy so-called geniuses, they seem to believe that the way things are currently run is stupid and wrong, and that they would do a much better job running things were they empowered like the emperor kings they deserve to be. But it's hard to tell because their beliefs tend to ebb and flow based on what serves them personally at any given moment. I wanted to demystify the black box of big money and bigger tech to find out who the players are, what they really want, and whether it's too late to stop them. This is how big tech owns JD Vance and why he could be even worse than Trump. Roll the intro. This is my perfect angel, Moira. Moira loves to sleep, but even more than that, she loves to eat. And Moira loves eating Sundays for dogs. Most healthy dog foods are frankly an expensive frozen mess. And I don't know if you've ever met a bulldog before, but being goopy is not something they need help with, okay? So adding goopy foods to the mix is really not it. Sundays is dog food that works with your life. No defrosting, no prep, no cleanup, just healthy and easy. Sundays is 100% human grade and uses only real food ingredients that you can recognize, pronounce, and probably eat yourself. It's not kibble, pre-cooked or frozen, it's gently air-dried to preserve nutrition and flavor. Sundays was founded by veterinarian Dr. Tori Waxman because she couldn't find a dog food that was as nutritious as home-cooked meals or as convenient as dry food. So over 3 years and over 17 formulations, she made it herself. And we love that. And Moira loves Sundays. Go to sundaysfordogs.com/Leeja or use code Leeja at checkout to get 50% off your first order. Thanks, Sundays. A lot of JD's background is laid out in his foul memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, so I'll spare you having to read it by giving you the highlights. JD Vance was born James Donald Bauman in post-industrial Middletown, Ohio on August 2nd, 1984. By the time he was a toddler, his mom, Bev Vance, had divorced his father and namesake, Donald Bauman. Life with Bev Vance was chaotic, to put it mildly. Her behavior was violent and often hysterical. She'd worked as a nurse until she started stealing prescription narcotics to get high. Rehab didn't shake her addiction, and she eventually moved on to stronger substances. Bev moved JD and his older sister Lindsay around a lot, but JD would return to Breathitt County, Kentucky every summer to visit his maternal grandparents' family, and has said that despite being raised in Ohio, his home was really in the holler. The holler is where he'd eventually go back to, moving in with his grandmother to escape his own mother. Whether he knew it at the time or not, moving in with his grandmother, aka Mama, was his first step out of poverty.
You gotta take care of business, you gotta go to school, you gotta get good grades to even have a chance.
That was a clip from Hillbilly Elegy, Vance's best-selling memoir turned Netflix movie flop that put him on the mainstream radar in 2016. I vividly remember this book being everywhere after Trump won the election. Liberals were reeling, trying to process what had just happened, and JD Vance offered a compelling explanation as to how the white working class could have possibly bought into what seemed like the patently terrible idea of making Trump president. According to Vance, who started writing the book as a Yale Law School project, hillbilly culture was to blame for the decay and suffering in post-industrial communities like his. Not structural problems that lock generations into cycles of poverty largely beyond their control or anything like that. They chose this. It's a cultural thing. They can't help it. They're just a bunch of dummies. A classic bootstrappist, Vance believed that the main thing holding back everyone he left behind in Middletown was what psychologist Martin Seligman calls learned helplessness, which basically happens when people are surrounded by so much misery that they simply resign themselves to failure. And yet at Vance's recent RNC speech, he leaned into the very same rural victim narrative he once claimed to resent, pointing to structural factors with rhetoric he once would have considered patronizing. But that's what he needed to say to pander to that specific crowd, so that's what he's pushing. And that's lesson number one with this guy. He's an opportunist who will say whatever he needs to win friends and favors and elections. Vance graduated from high school in 2003 and, like many of his former classmates, enlisted in the Marines, which to his and Trump's followers sounds really badass, but he was actually an office girly. He served like 6 months in Iraq working in the public affairs section of the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing. In his own words, quote, "I left for Iraq in 2005, a young idealist committed to spreading democracy and liberalism to the backward nations of the world. I returned in 2006, skeptical of the war and the ideology that underpinned it. Mama was dead, and without a church or anything to anchor me to the faith of my youth, I slid from devout to nominal and then to something very much less." After serving 4 years in the Marines, in 2007, Vance enrolled at Ohio State University. There, he started mingling with a more intellectual crowd and calling himself an atheist. If it seems like I'm giving a weird amount of attention to Vance's spiritual life, it's because his spiritual life is weirdly relevant to his political career. Vance, whose wife is Hindu, by the way, converted to Catholicism in 2019, about a year after being tapped for Leonard Leo's secretive, invite-only clique of young conservatives called the Teneo Network. As you may remember from my recent video, Leonard Leo is a devout Catholic, as were many early members of his originalist legal group, the Federalist Society. 6 of our 9 current Supreme Court justices are Catholic. That's notable considering only 20% of adults in America describe themselves as Catholic. To be fair, one of the Catholic justices was nominated by a Democratic president, and both Catholic presidents we've had have been Democrats. So I'm by no means trying to imply that all Catholics are in on some right-wing conspiracy, nor am I saying that a person must be Catholic to join said conspiracy. I'm just a passive observer who is pointing out a pattern, okay? Supposedly, the reason so many Irish and Italian Catholics were drawn to the Federalist Society early on was because they saw themselves as minority groups who had pretty recently been treated like dirt, but were suddenly being treated like members of the establishment and told they owed some other groups affirmative action. But in the modern context, I can't help wondering if there are things about Catholicism itself, separate from the cultural conditions of being Catholic in the 20th century, that positions Catholics to become radical conservatives. Here's my theory. First, and very importantly, Catholicism doesn't apologize for prosperity. Have you seen those churches? Gaudier than a Trump hotel. Because if God deserves a house to match the magnificence of his glory, surely his most special genius children also deserve whatever luxuries they can get their grubby little fingies on. Wealth is a way God smiles on his favorites. And should prosperity turn to greed or some other sin, nobody will be that surprised because even Jesus Christ himself was a sinner. So when a person does inevitably sin, the church has a system locked and loaded to help them atone. Hate the sin, love the sinner, baby. We're all sinners after all is a very convenient phrase to explain away any manner of evil. The Catholic Church also has a long history of evangelism, by which I mean the zealous recruitment of outsiders with or without their consent. When we talk about evangelical Christians, usually they're Protestants, but evangelism is also an approach to recruitment. Catholics are positive that they've cracked the code to heaven and that they're doing you a favor by forcing it upon you. Even if it sounds like a homophobic rant, it comes from a place of love. They're just worried about your eternal soul. You're welcome. Evangelism is also at the root of the traditionally large Catholic family. It's your duty to populate the earth with as many more Catholics as possible. And though all sorts of people are Catholic, when JD Vance and Leonard Leo talk about family, you know they only mean certain kinds of families. Though Vance's children are biracial, it's hard not to see the Great Replacement theory as aligned with the procreation mandate, especially when you look at the data. According to Pew Research, the overall percentage of Catholic U.S. adults is shrinking, but the portion of Catholic U.S. adults who are Hispanic is rising. In 2023, 20% of U.S. adults were Catholic, down 4% from 2007. Over the same period, the share of U.S. Catholics who were white dropped 8 percentage points, while the share who are Hispanic grew 4 points. Could this trend be further stressing out and radicalizing white Catholics who may already feel marginalized and worried about being replaced? Maybe. The point is, Vance is Catholic now and attributes all his best qualities, including having patience with his son and trying not to yell at his wife, to his new religion. Okay, where were we? Oh, right, Vance. He was going to undergrad at Ohio State University. He whizzed through in 2 years, graduating summa cum laude with a degree in political science and philosophy. And in 2010, he started at Yale Law School. It was a culture shock that I genuinely believe he's still recovering from today. His entire personality revolves around his perceived distance from or proximity to so-called cultural elites. Vance only wound up practicing law for 2 years, but Yale wasn't a total waste of time. It was where he met his future wife and the mother of his 3 children, Usha. They met at a panel on social decline in white America. Hot. Usha was at one point registered as a Democrat, and after her husband was announced as Trump's VP pick, she quit her job at a prestigious progressive law firm in San Francisco. I genuinely think this woman might be a masochist. Like, Usha, blink twice for help, girl. Vance has always been staunchly Republican. In fact, temporarily losing his faith to haughty intellectualism helped send him further to the right politically. In his own words, the GOP became a kind of totem. I attached myself to it ever more strongly because it gave me some common ground with my family. And the most respectable way to do so among my new college friends was through a dogged commitment to neoliberal economic orthodoxy. Tax breaks and Social Security cuts were socially acceptable ways to be conservative among the American elite. I mean, this man just oozes pick-me energy. The second most important connection Vance made at Yale was with billionaire tech investor Peter Thiel, who visited in 2011 to give a talk about one of his favorite subjects, the stagnation of technological innovation.
We live in a world where we've been working on the Star Trek computer in Silicon Valley, but we don't have anything else from Star Trek. We don't have the warp drive. We don't have the transporter. We can't, re-engineer matter in sort of this cornucopian world where there's no scarcity. And then, how good is a society where you have a well-functioning Star Trek computer, but nothing else from Star Trek?
Yeah, that's incredibly juicy.
At his core, Thiel is a disgruntled sci-fi nerd who believes that if humans were doing society correctly, we'd all have flying cars and be immortal by now, instead of a bunch of woke snowflakes with seasonal allergies, smartphone addictions, and a complicated relationship with microplastics. That said, Thiel's ideology is famously difficult to pin down. One biographer explained that while there are certainly strains of authoritarianism and libertarianism that run throughout Thiel's writing and political activities, Thielism is riddled with so many contradictions that it remains, at its core, largely a mystery. We may never have a full grasp on Peter Thiel's belief system, but we can look to his investments for clues. In the wake of Y2K, he got in on the ground floor of the Alcor Life Extension Foundation, which was trying to figure out how to freeze freshly dead people so they could be thawed out and revived at some later date. Whenever Thiel dies, he'll be rushed to a lab in Scottsdale, Arizona, to be turned into a corpsicle for what the company's literature describes as, theoretically, thousands of years. For about 6 years, Thiel funded an initiative to create autonomous microstates in international waters, as in tiny islands where rich people write the laws and govern themselves. Because wealthy geniuses should be allowed to do whatever they want. Everyone should just get off their backs. God. Thiel's libertarian roots were on full display with his first big success, PayPal. He thought it was destined to be a revolutionary digital wallet that could lead to the erosion of the nation state, but instead, PayPal gained popularity as an online transaction platform, eventually merging with a similar company called X, owned by Elon Musk. Yes, the same X. He's been sitting on X.com since the 90s. Can someone please explain this man's obsession with the letter X, because it is unsettling, frankly. After Thiel and Musk both moved on from PayPal, they remained in one another's orbit, including in 2008, when Thiel put $20 million into rescuing a flailing SpaceX. These days, Thiel is best known for figuring out how to use a Roth IRA to avoid paying hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes, secretly funding the Hulk Hogan lawsuit that took down Gawker in an act of delayed revenge for one of its subsidiary blogs outing him as gay in 2007, and of course for backing conservative loony cakes like Vance and Trump. And yes, Peter Thiel is gay. Talk about masochism. But when Thiel visited Yale Law back in 2011, he was a slightly more subdued character, best known for co-founding PayPal, being Facebook's first outside investor, and bankrolling a post-9/11 project that used big data to catch terrorists. JD Vance was smitten. Thiel was not only clearly a genius, but a Christian to boot, a fact that challenged everything Vance had internalized about religious people being dumb and atheists being smart. Thiel, in turn, ate this up. Being a contrarian is sort of his whole MO. It's also why he rode so hard for Trump in 2016. Thiel loves pushing against the man. But since Thiel is very much the man. He winds up just pushing against the literal structures and institutions that make up society. Among the institutions in his crosshairs, higher education. Despite having several degrees from Stanford, regularly lecturing at prestigious universities, and even teaching his own college course, Thiel has criticized higher ed for crushing innovation by creating arbitrary categories and skill sets. In his view, why take some schools' word for it that you'll be best prepared for your future career by taking a broad slate of courses, becoming well-rounded in any way, or expanding your exposure to new ideas and areas of study, when you could just hyper-focus and become a super genius at one super niche self-serving thing? Years later, Vance would credit Thiel not only with his decision to abandon the legal profession, but also his conversion to Catholicism, which sounds like a lot to lay at someone's doorstep until you realize that JD Vance owes his entire career to Peter Thiel. After graduating from Yale in 2013, Vance spent about 2 years in the legal profession before accepting the first of what would become a long line of job opportunities handed to him by his sugar daddy slash mentor slash BFF, Peter Thiel. Thiel got Vance a job as the director of operations at Circuit Therapeutics, a biotech company whose CEO owed Thiel a favor. By 2016, Vance had moved on to venture capital with a job at a Thiel-founded firm called 𝗧𝗪𝗡𝗏, one of an annoying number of Peter Thiel-founded companies named after shit from The Lord of the Rings. The same year, Thiel penned a blurb for his protege's new book, 𝗬𝗪𝗡𝗏 𝗪𝗓𝗓. One of the book's biggest fans was Donald Trump Jr., who reportedly read the memoir and, quote, fucking went bananas over it. The pair developed a close friendship that's been credited with getting Vance onto Team Trump. It's unlikely he would have made it on the ticket without Don Jr. stepping in to smooth things over and convince his dear old dad to forgive some of Vance's spicier comments, like that time he said Trump could become America's Hitler, and that other time he described him as cultural heroin. Though Vance wouldn't run for office for a few more years, 𝗬𝗪𝗡𝗪𝗓 𝗪𝗓𝗓 signaled his entrance into the political arena. On the heels of the book's success, he moved back to his home state and launched a short-lived nonprofit called Our Ohio Renewal to combat addiction. It was a logical move given the content of his bestseller, but the organization was a flop. Its most notable accomplishment was funding a year-long residency for a single addiction specialist who turned out to be in the pocket of Purdue Pharma, the same company that created the crisis in the first place. At the same time as Vance was failing to give proper oversight to his nonprofit, he was also phoning it in as a partner at a DC-based venture capital firm called Revolution, established by AOL co-founder Steve Case, who has since said that the VP nominee wasn't really working that much for the 18 months he was employed at Revolution. In 2020, Vance launched his own VC firm, 𝗪𝗔𝗔 Capital. Yes, that is another Lord of the Rings reference, and yes, of course, Peter Thiel was involved. In addition to serving on 𝗪𝗔𝗔's leadership advisory committee, Thiel rallied a bunch of his pals to contribute around $120 million to get 𝗪𝗔𝗔 going. By the time Vance left 𝗪𝗔𝗔 to join the Senate last year, he started his first term in office last year. By that time, the company had invested in more than 100 startups, many of them launched or backed by Thiel, many of them right-leaning tech projects, including Rumble, the conservative version of YouTube. Thiel was predictably Vance's largest donor during his campaign in 2022, contributing around $15 million to a super PAC supporting him. Perhaps just as importantly, Thiel also used his leverage as a major 2016 Trump campaign donor and advisor to arrange an introduction between Vance and Trump at Mar-a-Lago. With Trump's endorsement, Thiel's money, and Thiel's friends' money, Vance became a senator last year. Since then, he's worked to oppose abortion, mask mandates, and flip-flopped on organized labor while claiming that the 2020 election was stolen. Vance often uses the phrase, "the culture war is class war," to summarize his belief that morally bankrupt liberals have normalized all sorts of unacceptable sin in society, which companies then co-sign and amplify by capitalizing on our worst impulses. So when Vance talks about why he opposes gender-affirming care for trans kids, he gets to make two arguments in one. First, that being trans is obviously wrong and gross and shouldn't be encouraged. And second, that big pharma is exploiting the depraved desire to feel at home in one's own body just to make a profit, which is also bad, double bad. The childless cat ladies he loves to roast online aren't just victims of a backward culture that lured them away from homemaking. They're also the victims of every corporation peddling cat accessories as well. Vance claims that the liberal elite establishment has weaponized progressive values to further its own economic and political interests and influence at the expense of innovation, progress, and real Americans. He believes that we need a full reset. And he's not alone. In Vance's short time in Washington, he's already emerged as the poster boy and de facto leader of a loose but very scary movement of young, contrarian, elite conservatives called the New Right. The New Right's philosophy, which you might also hear being called post-liberalism or national conservatism, is anti-woke, big business skeptical, nationalist on trade and border policies, and weirdly flirtatious with Hungary's authoritarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. It's also been called an intellectual version of Trumpism, meaning it brings all the same energy but with a much more highbrow reading list and a lot of insider vocab, much of it provided by the unofficial philosopher in residence of Peter Thiel's universe, Curtis Yarvin. Yarvin is a 51-year-old programmer turned blogger who once wrote an article suggesting that unproductive people should be converted into biodiesel to power public transportation. I shit you not. Yarvin is a pioneer of the far-right neo-reaction movement, stylized as NRX, also sometimes called the Dark Enlightenment, which sees nation-states and the global economy as we know it as hopelessly outdated. Yarvin considers it his duty to wake people up from the Truman Show and convince them of the truth, that dictatorships are far superior to democracies. In Yarvin's view, conservatives need a strong leader to take power back from the oligarchy and run society like a startup. Pay no attention to the fact that 90% of startups fail. In Yarvin's 2017 book, Patchwork, A Political System for the 21st Century, he lays out his vision for a nationless world. Instead of traditional government, things would be run by a global web of thousands of sovereign and independent mini-countries, each governed by its own realm. Realms in this fantasy are joint stock corporations with absolute power to run things without regard to the residents' opinions, which is so much more efficient. The first step towards Yarvin's vision of utopia? RAGE. An acronym for Retire All Government Employees. It may feel like Project 2025 came out of nowhere with the idea to dismantle the so-called administrative state, but this plan has actually been in the works for a while. Yarvin is a popular figure at the annual National Conservatism Conference, though it's important to reaffirm that National Conservatism doesn't have a single set of ideas either. As James Pogue reported in Vanity Fair, attendees make up a colorful political spectrum. The podcasters, bro-ish anonymous Twitter posters, online philosophers, artists, and amorphous scenesters in this world are variously known as dissidents, neo-reactionaries, post-leftists, or the heterodox fringe, though they're all often grouped for convenience under the heading of America's New Right. They have a wildly diverse set of political backgrounds, with influences ranging from 17th century Jacobite royalists to Marxist cultural critics to so-called reactionary feminists to the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, whom they sometimes refer to with semi-ironic affection as Uncle Ted. So while it's lumped in with traditional conservatism, the New Right looks very different from what most people would understand to be the conservative movement, at least for now. At the RNC this month, Trump and the Republican Party unveiled a new platform and set of ideologies that strays from traditional conservatism and mirrors some of the ideology of the New Right, a very real manifestation of the growing influence of this disjointed ideology. And you can see why Peter Thiel is into this. One of his most famous ideas is that capitalism and competition are actually antonyms. In his view, progress can only be achieved by monopolists untethered to consumer preferences and market forces. Basically, let the mega rich geniuses call the shots. Clearly they can run a company, so that means they can also run society. At the same time, Thiel and Vance disparage the prestige Olympics they say are preoccupying American elites. Ironically, they both have multiple degrees from prestigious institutions, yet resent those same structures nonetheless. This resentment can actually be traced to Vance's Yale days, when Thiel's speech helped him realize that he was right for feeling like he was on a hamster wheel, competing for the next opportunity that would make him miserable. In Vance's own words, success of this movement will mean that his son grows up in a world where his masculinity, his support of his family and his community, his love of his community, is more important than whether he works for fucking McKinsey. What's wild to me about national conservatism, at least the Peter Thiel, JD Vance flavor of it, is that it has identified the same problems that progressives are also concerned about, and it gets so close to humanism and then grabs the steering wheel and goes straight off a fucking cliff. Oh, you're worried about corporations capitalizing on our basest desires for belonging, for turning our identities into an opportunity for maximum profit? You think government actors prioritize their own interests and influence at the expense of everyday Americans? You hate being on the productivity hamster wheel and wish you lived in a world where your worth depended on your character and not your job title? You want to stick it to the man? And to you, the answer to these problems is, I'm seeing here, force people to fit into very narrow definitions of male and female heterosexuality against their will and dismantle the government in favor of mini nation states run like startup companies. Did I get that right? No notes? Awesome. That is the world Peter Thiel, his protege JD Vance, and their new right ilk want to live in. Unfettered corporate greed and unelected powerful leaders. And they're making serious moves to make that world a reality. According to NPR, shortly after Vance was announced as Trump's VP pick, a new tech-aligned super political action committee was unveiled called 𝗪𝗧𝗧𝗥𝗧. The group has raised more than $8 million according to Federal Election Commission filings. The group's war chest could turn into a formidable force for the Trump campaign. And the Wall Street Journal has reported that Elon Musk could funnel as much as $45 million a month into the effort. And it makes sense why they're throwing their serious capital behind Trump now that Vance is his VP pick. They have a very, very real chance of getting one of their own boys inside the walls of the White House, which would give them the necessary influence to dismantle the government from the inside out, as laid out in Project 2025, written by the Heritage Foundation, which has received hundreds of thousands of dollars in funding from a donor-advised fund that has in turn received millions from Peter Thiel's own foundation. Reminder that billionaires use foundations to legally launder their money and lower their tax burden while buying out politicians and pushing for an even lower tax burden, and on until the sun finally explodes and relieves us from our misery. But win or lose in November, Trump was just phase one, the agent of chaos needed to start smashing democracy from the inside. Vance and co. are still coming, and the radical vision for the Republican Party spans decades, not years. Vance understands that to pull off the wholesale turnaround he envisions, they need to do what the Koch family and other big-name libertarian donors have done for the past half-century. Build a sprawling system of think tanks, donor networks, educational institutions, professional programs, and media outlets to support their ideological allies on Capitol Hill. And to this end, Vance has already entrenched himself in all the right Washington circles. His staff was pulled from the most conservative groups in town, and in addition to being part of Leonard Leo's Teneo network, Vance is also tight with Heritage Foundation president Kevin Roberts and was a founding board member of American Moment, a group that trains young populist-minded conservatives to work in junior-level staff positions on Capitol Hill. He also helped set up the Rockbridge Network, a coalition of wealthy conservative donors and tech billionaires who are interested in supporting Trump and a broader nationalist populist agenda. Since it's almost impossible to tell what Vance or Thiel or even Trump really believe, it's very likely that the main reason Vance was put on the ticket was to bring in money from tech billionaires who want to delay regulations on everything from AI to cryptocurrency and beyond for as long as possible. It's simple as that. And since Vance reportedly has $250,000 worth of Bitcoin, the tech bros see him as a potential ally who understands that regulation will only ruin everything great about crypto, specifically that it's untraceable, untaxed, and untethered to any government. And though there is some overlap between Silicon Valley money and new right thinking, they're far from synonymous. Overall, Silicon Valley has had a pretty liberal reputation, but a small yet mighty contingent of scorned geniuses is emerging to push back on that narrative. They're sick of DEI departments and government agencies telling them what to do and suggesting that they might not be as special as they'd like to believe. So they're fighting back by coming out as conservative and putting their money where their mouths have probably always been, behind the scenes. But attempts to peer inside the black box of their ideology are doomed to fail because they're not consistent. Billionaire investor Marc Andreessen has claimed he's supporting Trump for the first time because Biden's proposed 25% tax on the uber wealthy would end venture capital and destroy American innovation. But I'm confused because Peter Thiel said that American innovation is long dead, so which is it? Well, it's both. It's neither. It's whatever the billionaire wants it to be at any given moment. Think about Elon Musk and how watery and self-serving everything he does is. He's a free speech absolutist, but only until it's time to sue for defamation. On the one hand, this is low-key comforting because there's not actually a grand conspiracy afoot. These people are too stupid and self-serving to actually build a cohesive movement. On the other hand, it's still scary that a bunch of selfish billionaires are using their money to do whatever they want. And until we get money out of politics, they'll just keep doing it. But first, we have to keep Trump out of office. So for fuck's sake, please vote in November. And if you're already planning on it, see if you can think of one person you could convince to vote against Trump in November as well. That's all I'm asking. Just think about it as an experiment. Shout out to my newest supporters, as well as supporters in my royal tier, and a very special shout out to my multi-platinum supporters, 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗏 Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, Tay, and Brett Piontek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. Check out the link in the description to join us over on Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, you'll also like the one I made about how lobbying is ruining our democracy. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.